Sean Finnegan, and you are listening to Restitutio, a podcast that seeks to recover authentic Christianity and live it out today. How much control should Christian groups exercise over their people? Should people be free to research and diverge from past ways of thinking, or do they always have to just toe the line? In this interview, I talk with William Barlow, who grew up in the Way International, but ran into problems when he started suggesting changes to the administrators at the Way Core Leadership Training Program. After 3.5 years of attending, when he was just a few months from graduation, they dismissed him from the program, dashing his dreams of becoming a minister. Thankfully, his story did not end there. Here now is podcast 313, Questioning Way International Doctrines with Will Barlow. Welcome to Restitutio, Will Barlow. So glad to have you with me today.
Glad to be on. Big fan of Restitutio.
Cool. So let's start from the beginning. How did you become a Christian? Were you raised in a Christian home?
I was raised in a very loving Christian environment. I grew up attending fellowships with the Way International. In some sense, I guess you could say I was born into it. And my dad, he started reading the Bible in his teens. He didn't really attend church growing up much. He started reading the Bible in his teens. And by the time he was going to college, he'd sort of figured the Trinity thing out. He'd sort of figured out that Jesus Christ wasn't God. And so he was, I would say, somewhat looking for something. But he's a very laid-back kind of guy. My mom, she grew up Roman Catholic. She was very hungry for God by the time she went to college. She wanted to see more of his love and his power. And so they met pretty early on at the University of Kansas. And at that time, the University of Kansas was a big place for people to get into the Way International. And around the time they were introduced to each other, a bunch of their friends made the decision to take Power for Abundant Living, PFAL. And so they took PFAL in the winter of 73. And then they were married in May of 73. And my dad kept attending Way fellowships, and my mom didn't. It took her some time, growing up Roman Catholic, to work herself through the Trinity piece, which I'm thankful to say eventually she did successfully. So she started attending Way fellowships again right after I was born. So I grew up attending a Way fellowship. And
where were you growing up?
All over the place, Sean. I was born in Kansas, and we moved to Missouri for a couple of years, and then Toledo, Ohio. And then we were going to go WOW, I think it was in 94. It was the last year of the WOW program, and it ended up getting canceled. And so we had sold our home and packed up everything, and we were ready to go. And so
And how old were you back then in 94?
I was 8, almost 9.
All right, so you're just going with the flow. You're a kid.
That's
during
right.
This
Yep.
period.
I'm just following along. Yep.
All right. Well, for the audience members who maybe aren't familiar with your background or my background, how would you describe the Way International? Like, what is the Way? Because I know that probably a lot of people would just say, well, it's a denomination. But I don't think Way people would like to be called a denomination. So maybe you could just describe that, as well as describe PFAL is and the WOW program, those three things.
Absolutely. Yeah, so the Way is a non-denominational church, and they're very proud of calling themselves non-denominational. And like you said, if you were to call them a denomination, they'll say, no, we're not a denominational church. We're non-denominational.
Them's fighting words.
That's right, exactly. They don't like that very much. But in some sense, like you said, they have I would say they have a very well-defined, at this point, a very well-defined doctrine, and they have a history and traditions that they uphold like any other church. And so I think it's fair to call them, a non-denominational church with a robust set of traditions. So whatever you make of that, PFAL was a class, Power for Abundant Living was a class that was offered by Victor Paul Werwol, starting, I believe, in the late 50s, early 60s. It was eventually taped. From what I've heard and what I've read about, even in recent years, millions of people have taken that class through the history of that class being offered. And it was designed essentially as a crash course on how to read and understand the Bible. The way, historically speaking, considers itself a research, teaching, and fellowship ministry. And I would say there was a time when that was absolutely true, that there was a lot of research going on along with the teaching and the fellowship. And I would say that since Victor Paul Wierwille's death in 85, there's not been nearly as much research as there has been teaching and fellowship. And that will get, I think, fully explained in my story. Sure. And then the WOW program was designed, it's Word Over the World Ambassadors program, and it was designed as a missionary program, much like other churches do, like the Mormon Church, for example. They send out missionaries. And so the WOW program was designed to be a year-long intensive missionary program, community outreach, essentially church planting. The goal was you take a concentrated group of people and you have them live together and you have them read the Bible every day and go out and witness to people every day with the intent of them attending, getting people to attend a way fellowship to the point of taking PFAL. And it usually culminated in, set one or multiple classes being run in a given year. And that's more or less how success was defined. I mean, the way says it's not about numbers, but it, just like with every church, there's bills to pay and there's things that have to be done. So,
sure.
So ultimately, there is a bottom line involved in the back of the mind.
Mm-hmm. So moving forward, I mean, because I kind of had a very similar background to you, except I don't remember exactly how old I was. Maybe it was 8, maybe a little younger. Maybe I was more like, what year did you say Victor Wierwille died? 85?
85.
Yeah, so I guess I would have been 6 then. So I was a little kid when my parents ended up leaving the way, probably between 6 and 8 years old. I'm not sure exactly. When you're a kid, you're just going with the flow. I mean, what do you know? You know that, hey, we have church in our home, we sing these songs, and we all read the King James Version. And
that's right, exactly.
We all look up to this figure named Dr. Wierwille, and that's what you know as a kid. It's pretty simple. Now, going forward from there, essentially my group back in the, I guess, mid to late 80s, then started to diverge from Way International teaching, and we changed a lot of our beliefs over time, especially in the 90s, especially in the mid and late 90s. And we have some things that are the same as far as ethos and a couple of beliefs that we felt stood the test of time and criticism and biblical inquiry, and then others that haven't. So, but that's not at all really your experience. You continued on and grew up in your teen years in the way environment, right?
That's exactly right.
Right.
Yeah.
So what was that like for you? Was it very nurturing and great, or was it oppressive and difficult, or what was it like for you?
Yeah, my wife grew up on staff, and so we share stories, and her recollections of things, especially in the 90s, were very different than my recollections of things. Some of my earliest memories are like playing basketball on the back porch, Little Tykes hoop, and I would try to enlist the adults in our fellowship to play with me, and oftentimes they would, so I grew up really in a very nurturing environment, and many of the leaders that I knew and the people that I interacted with on a regular basis were just very loving, supportive people. And from a doctrinal perspective, I think one of the things that really has meant a lot to me personally is, my dad used to sit us down when we were kids, and he would say stuff like, I don't care who's talking about the Bible, whether it's someone in fellowship or someone at the church down the street, you check what they're saying with the Bible.
Oh, wow.
And so that was my dad's stance on things. And, looking back at the period of time he sat me down, I'm sure there was some stuff being said, in Sunday teaching services at the Way that were pretty wild. And so maybe that was in the back of his mind as he was saying this to us, but I think just in general, that principle has stuck with me. And so I think in some sense, having come to the Restorationist movement later in life, I sort of feel like that's where I belonged the whole time. It's just
interesting. Yeah.
I was sort of in the way trying to figure things out for a lot of my life.
Cool. You continued growing up, and you were in the Way Corps. Is that true?
That is true. Yep. So I'll back up for just a second. I took all the ways classes that they offered, the foundational class, intermediate class. I was always, taking the classes. I was always reading the materials and doing the things I was supposed to do, which essentially means reading the books that Victor Paul Worrell wrote. And when I turned 16, that was the earliest you could take the advanced class. I took the advanced class the summer after I turned 16. Before we went to the advanced class, we had to do all these home studies. We had to do all these things to prepare, make sure that we had covered all of our bases. And so I dutifully went through all those things and enjoyed it. I enjoyed learning and wanted to know more about God and more about the Bible. And I remember at the advanced class, at age 16, I really, at that point, that was the moment when I felt the call of God for me to serve his people. Of course, at that time, I interpreted that call to be a call to the Way Corps specifically. And different people go through that calling experience in different ways. For me, it was just a realization that nothing in life, I just sort of rationally decided that nothing in life is more important than helping people understand, love, and serve God. And
Yes.
so when I got to that point, when that sort of realization rationally seeped into my mind, it was just like, well, I'm going to go Way Corps. That's it, And so at 16, my heart was set. That was my goal. That was my dream. And I spent, so much of my adult life leading to that point.
And what is the Way Corps?
The Way Corps is the leadership training program that the Way utilizes. There's some unique things about the Way Corps that's different. Most seminaries will require you to sign a statement of faith before you go in. At least the conservative ones will. The liberal ones, they don't care as much what you believe or
They care that you
worship.
you pay the bill.
That's right, exactly. So I would say the Way is it's more than a doctrinal statement. It's strict adherence to what the Way currently teaches, and there's also certain things that do's and don'ts from a behavior perspective in terms of being on time to meetings and being sharp and looking like your life is together. And I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that go into that. And the other thing that's unique about the Way Corps is that if you decide to go into the Way Corps and you also want to be married and have a family, for example, then your spouse also has to be Way Corps. So in my case, before I even really dated my wife, we met and I was just out of college and she was still in college, and we joked that it was her job interview, and part of that job, the questions I wanted to know, the things that I wanted to ask her about was, do you want to be Way Corps, and how do you feel about the Way? And she said yes, she wanted to be Way Corps, and she said, I don't think the Way is perfect, but I think I can help fix it. And that's exactly what I wanted to know. And I'm one of those people that I grew up in the Way and had a overwhelmingly, I would say, great experience in my younger years. But even with that, I knew that there were big problems, both doctrinally and practically, in the Way, even by the time I was fresh out of college and hadn't really started serving in any leadership capacity at that point.
All right, well, let's come back to that. What was your experience in the Way Corps? Did you graduate? How many years were you in it?
Yep. So the Way Corps is a 4-year program. The first year is a candidate year, and it's designed for you to work with the leadership locally in your home environment. And it's basically designed to help you get to the point where they feel like you're mature enough to handle the training, and you've checked off enough of the check boxes, and it's stuff like, can they lead a meeting, and can they teach, and can they move the word, can they get people in the word, can they run classes, all the little check boxes that you can think of in terms of administering an organization. And then you have to be out of debt, any kind of debt, credit card debt, student debt, medical debt, no debt whatsoever, not even a mortgage.
Or college debt?
No college debt, nothing, no. And, I know people have hidden things or tried to hide things, and some of them may have gotten away with it at times, but, we were upfront and honest, we were out of debt. So we got through that year in Atlanta. We completed our first year, and then the second year is a missionary year. You go out and you do the Way Disciple program, and the Way Disciple is a 6-month version of WOW. Essentially, they cut it in half, and We were on a team of 12 young people, and we went to a suburb of Detroit, Michigan, and we ran a foundational class. So we were successful, and it was a challenging experience, but it was a very rewarding one. We met some wonderful people along our time in Detroit, and I think we impacted some people positively. And so it was, like I said, very difficult but rewarding. And then there are 2 years that they call the in residence years. And those are essentially you're at the Ways campus, mostly in Ohio, and you're cloistered away, taking classes and doing all sorts of extracurriculars, working out and tending a garden and all these other things that they think are important to training. And we completed about a year and a half of our in residence training. So we were 3.5 years in before we were dismissed from the Way Corps.
Wow. You got dismissed.
That's correct. Yep.
Man. Well, before we get into why you were dismissed, let me return to the question of when did you start perceiving some issues with the Way as you were going through all this?
Right. So like I mentioned, my dad sort of set in the back of my mind always, take everything back to the Bible. And so when I was in college, and really no one knew this when it was going on, but I had what I call now a crisis of faith. And what I mean by that is I went back, I started realizing in conversations with other people around me that, there are things that the Way taught that were very different. And I already knew that the Trinity was controversial. I knew that there were other things that the Way taught that may be controversial, but I hadn't looked into a lot of it. And I'll tell you, one of the moments that really led to me having this crisis of faith was I was a freshman in college, and my first serious girlfriend was an Eastern Orthodox, and she said to me, why do you not believe that Jesus is God? And I said, there's this verse and that verse and this verse and that verse. And she said, well, what about John 1:1? And I said, let me open up this book and see if I can read this chapter out loud to you. So I literally read this chapter out loud from Jesus Christ is Not God, written by Victor Paul Worrell. And as I'm reading it, I'm like, this is crazy. Like, who could believe that this adequately answers the question of how we read John 1:1? And I was like, oh man, I gotta do better than this. And so, long story short, I didn't end up staying with that girlfriend much after that.
Let me just ask a quick timeline question just to clarify. So you went to regular college before you went to the Way Corps seminary?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And so what school did you go to?
I went to Vanderbilt University in Nashville.
Vanderbilt, and what did you study there?
I was a math and physics major.
Math and physics. So you have your bachelor's in that?
That's right.
Okay, so you're at Vanderbilt, or Vandy as they call it, and
that's right.
You're studying there, and so you're amped up to go into ministry, right? That's still very much part of your thinking, but the way handles clergy is they have you support yourself. Is that true, or why were you going to a regular college and not just straight to the Way Corps?
Many of the Way Corps ministers throughout the United States, and probably the world as well, many of them work their own jobs. They work secularly. They're not supported in a full-time capacity. So that was one reason why I went to college and wanted to get, a degree. The other reason was because I realized that one of the ways I thought I could serve God was by writing and by teaching people. And I had an aptitude for math and for physics, and I was already interested in the study of apologetics, although I didn't know what it was called at the time. And so that really drove me to study physics, was to understand more about creation and how I could understand it in relation to the Bible and that sort of thing. I never really saw myself going into a PhD program and being a professional physicist. But I did know I wanted to get a degree, and I knew that a degree in math and physics, I could do a number of things coming out. And I've proven that by eventually becoming an actuary after teaching math for a period of time too. So, but yes, I was 19 at the time. I was having this conversation with my girlfriend in my dorm room, slogging through John 1.
Yeah, and so what came of that after you realized that the holy textbook of Jesus Christ is not God didn't have maybe the best explanation on that verse? Where did that leave you?
Well, so essentially, I stripped my faith down to I believe in God and I believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. In other words, I wasn't going to go study Buddhism for an extended period of time or Islam, and I really already at that point had experienced enough of God to know that He existed. But I really just was like, okay, I believe in God and the Lord Jesus Christ. I don't know if they're a Trinity, if they're co-equal, co-eternal, if Jesus pre-existed. I don't know any of these things. I'm going to go to the Bible, and so that's what I did. I really intensely studied the Gospels and other sections, especially of the New Testament. I started reading I reached out to a couple of friends, and I started reading everything I could get my hands on. I read both Buzzard books. I read Brian Holt's book. I read a lot of Patrick Novice's book. I read some of the church fathers. I read Rubenstein's When Jesus Became God.
Classic.
Right, exactly. And I read excerpts from a number of other, articles, and I read Trinitarian sources too. And I listened to famous Trinitarian teachings. I've listened to Walter Martin on multiple occasions. I wish I had the Trinities podcast back in the day, but that was before
Dale Tuggy's podcast.
That's right. Yeah, I wish I had Dale riding shotgun in my journey, but I'm thankful to know him now. Thankful to have those resources now. But yeah, that's sort of what I did. Is I attacked it very robustly, and out of that actually came a manuscript that I wrote shortly after I graduated college. I'm still
what was it called?
Working on it. It's called The Only True God.
John 17:3.
That's right. Yeah. So, and that ultimately is one of the reasons I got in trouble because I tried to submit that manuscript through the Ways process of doing research, and essentially my leadership in Arkansas at the time. He said he wasn't really capable of handling the Greek and the other stuff. He wasn't much of a scholar. And he said, I think there's some good stuff here, but I don't think the time for this has come yet. And so I actually sent it to a personal friend, a former fellowship coordinator, about a year later. And he decided to hand it off to the Ohio State coordinator, who's also what the Way calls a region coordinator, overseeing multiple states at that time. He was also, incidentally, the minister who officiated my wedding. And so I got a phone call from him saying, why did you send this manuscript to your old fellowship coordinator? And I said, because he's a family friend, and I thought he'd enjoy reading it, And he was like, well, that's not how we do things in the Way. And I was like, okay. He's like, you should have sent this to me. And I said, okay. I mean, do you want to look at it? He's like, no, I'm going to send it to your branch coordinator first, then we can talk about it. And
so why was he mad? He was mad because you sent it to somebody in Ohio, not somebody in Arkansas?
No, at that time I was living in Ohio, so protocol would have been for me not to send it to anybody, just send it through the leadership channels, which is what I had tried in Arkansas and hadn't worked. That's why I told him
All right, so he was mad that instead of you sending it to your fellowship coordinator, you sent it to the regional coordinator directly.
No, he was mad that I sent it to a friend, which was a former fellowship coordinator of mine, instead of sending it to him or to my branch coordinator, my most immediate leadership. So okay. I wasn't following Way
That's kind of weird.
No, it is absolutely weird. He also, more or less, and I'm not trying to disparage this gentleman because I have, again, a lot of positive experiences with him in my life, but he also essentially yelled at me for about an hour because he thought I was being arrogant for thinking I was better than Dr. Werwol, which is a typical thing that I've seen in the Way, having produced research that contradicts or tries to improve upon the current teachings.
Yeah, I would argue that that's exactly the wrong mindset to have. I hope, as a father, I hope that my children are far superior to me.
Absolutely.
And that their understanding of the world and of God and of the faith, first of all, I hope that they choose those things once they're at that age where they're able to make those decisions on their own, but that they would far surpass me. And I would hope that Victor Werrell would have wanted people to surpass him as well. Mm-hmm. And not just to toe the line.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a much more noble aspiration than preserving this one understanding that can never change. I mean, that's so Catholic.
Absolutely.
No offense to any Catholic listeners out there, but like the whole idea of having a deposit of faith that can never change because, the council has spoken or the Pope has spoken. That's not a Protestant mindset at all.
Absolutely not.
So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Yeah, and I think again to your point, in the context of being self-proclaiming that you're a research, teaching, and fellowship ministry, I think that was the hard part for me. Is I was always sort of led to believe that, look, if you've got a better way of teaching things, if you've got a better way of understanding things, then bring that forward and we'll look at it. We'll see if we can't incorporate it. And I eventually found out that was a lie. Just to put it bluntly. And I think the allegation that I always heard about other people who had done similar things was, oh, they made demands, or they had an ego, or they couldn't wait for the big ship of the way to change its mind, so they just up and left. And in my case, it's none of those things. I've tried to deal with things as humbly as I can. I've tried to deal with things in the proper protocol, especially throughout my later years in the way. Once I knew the protocol, because that minister certainly clarified the protocol for me in that conversation. So I just tried to do things the way that the way wanted it, and I still ended up getting into trouble later.
Wow. So let's talk about how things ended up at the Way Corps.
Right.
Why did you get dismissed? And tell me that story a little bit.
Sure. So, it's just like any school. You don't want to be in the principal's office, generally speaking. That's not where you want to be. The Way Corps coordinator is essentially the principal. He or she, usually it's a married couple. They're the Corps coordinators. They oversee that training program. And if you're called into their office, usually it's for positive things. It's, hey, can you help me with this research assignment? Or, hey, can you help identify what's going on with so-and-so, and let's get a resolution on this. And usually it was for good reasons. I was called into the Corps coordinator's office. There were 2 times in my training where it wasn't. And the second one is the one that you're interested in. And that's the one, my buddy, so I had a very close friend during this whole time. We were in the same year in residence, and we had studied the Bible a lot together over the year and a half that we were there together. And he and I were called into our Corps coordinator's office, and the allegation was that we were gossiping about the things that were wrong about the Way's teachings in the breaks in between classes. And, the thing about that allegation is sometimes we did talk about things that we thought were wrong with what the Way currently was teaching or taught in that particular class. So that part was true. We never really made fun of things, and if we did make fun of things, it was sort of one of those things, laugh because you want to cry kind of things, because it hurt us. We had the heart that we wanted to present only the best information, and if we thought something was lacking and that people were going along with it, then that's a sad thought, and so it was never a holier than thou kind of laughter. It was just sort of a, oh man, look, this is just not right, But that particular incident, the laughter was because my buddy was researching something that was somewhat controversial, which was what Jesus Christ is up to. That was essentially his research paper for his Way Corps, his final paper for the Way Corps.
Is that Jesus' current heavenly ministry? Is that what you're talking about?
He was trying to figure out just anything related to what Jesus was up to and involved with, because the current Way teaching on that is that essentially they don't talk about Jesus as doing anything currently. He's waiting to come back.
Right. That's what I was. Yeah, that's what I was referring to.
Yeah,
so he's looking into what is Jesus currently doing in heaven.
Right.
What is his role?
Right. Exactly. How is he? He's looking at Ephesians and saying, look, he's the source of supply here. He's looking at Colossians and he's saying, look, you got to be connected to the head. And he's asking the right questions. Even at the time, I thought these were the right questions. How do we understand what Jesus is doing and how he's impacting the church? And that, that's was a very controversial subject in the Way. It still is to this day in the Way. This is about 5 years ago now. So we had been listening to a class, and that morning in class, Dr. Worrell, I think it was we were listening to an old tape. He had said something that corroborated a lot of what my buddy was finding. And so that's what we were laughing about. We were laughing about, look, these guys aren't even listening to what the mentor, the teacher, said in class. They're not even listening to everything that he wrote, because there were things that he wrote about that would be controversial in the current ways understanding of things. And so that's what we were laughing about. We're laughing at the irony of the fact that what he was studying shouldn't even be controversial at all to begin with.
And they heard you laughing or saw you laughing, and they rebuked you for that.
They didn't rebuke us. They went to our core coordinator behind our back and said, we think Will and his buddy are doing evil things. You need to check in on them. And he believed it, so he called us in the office. And when we explained to our core coordinator what happened, he understood, and he said, okay, don't talk to each other after class, period. So that was the thing. For us to resolve the situation, it was the whole, like, go to your own room. You kids, you're causing trouble for everyone else. Just go to your own room. And that had happened to us before. We'd had similar problems in our first year at the very beginning. And it's just people letting their minds run and not having the guts to come talk to us about what we were really talking about. And I really wish they'd come and talk to us, but that's not how it went down.
All right. So then what happened next?
So then, I was ready to leave the meeting because I didn't, like I said, I don't like being in the principal's office, don't like being in trouble. I try to stay in between the lines generally. And my buddy wasn't as much like that. And so he said to the core coordinator, well, we have things that we have feedback on about, like, the foundational class and other things. We'd like to talk to you about those things. And this particular core coordinator was a brand new core coordinator. He had just gotten the job. He was in our generation, so he was only a couple of years older than me. And I had a previous relationship with him because I knew his dad very well. So, we felt, and so did my buddy. And so we felt comfortable going to him and saying, look, these are the things that we're seeing. Are we crazy or not? Just having a private conversation, not trying to change anything officially, not trying to rile anyone else up. We kept this between the two of us, and then we wanted to loop him in and get his opinion on things. And so he said, sure, write down the things that you think we could improve on, and I'd love to have that conversation with you. And so what that ended up with was a 10-page, about 100 bullet point feedback on the foundational class. And your chuckle says it all. I mean, how do you think that's going to be received, right? I mean, and most of it was ticky stuff. It was maybe we can explain John 1 better. Maybe we can explain Colossians 1 better. It was all bullet pointed. There was no, I wasn't trying to, it wasn't a manifesto, it was simple, basic stuff. And it was meant to be the beginning of a conversation between the two of us who had been talking about some of this stuff, and then our way core coordinator that we wanted to loop in. And so we sent it via confidential memo. And I wanted to read to you
sure,
the memo that we sent. This is the text on the memo that we sent. And this is a totally way of doing this. God bless you. Please see the attached information. This is not meant to be hypercritical. These are ideas that we believe would help us solidify an already life-changing class and help move the word even better. The material presented in this document is by no means a polished presentation of the information. We would love to discuss any of these points at your convenience. We have not and will not share this information with anyone else. Thank you for taking the time to review these items. So that was placed in a confidential box for our way core coordinator's eyes only. And, we promised to abide by all the standards that the way would have regarding research. And, the main thing that they're concerned about is that the rotten apples don't spoil the whole bunch, right? So we said, look, we're not going to share this with anyone else.
It seems like there's just a heck of a lot of control issues going on here.
Yes, yep, absolutely.
I wonder what they're so afraid of, because usually fear is what drives control. Absolutely.
No, and I think the response to this, I think you'll see fear on a couple different people's parts, because we sent that, I believe it was on a Monday morning, we turned that in. And then we heard nothing for 3 days. Then on Thursday, we were pulled out of our block assignments. And block assignments during the way corps, in the morning typically you have class, in the afternoon you work a job at the way. And it could be in grounds where you cut the grass and rake leaves and all that kind of stuff. It could be in the auditorium cleaning brass or vacuuming or working on stage or set design. It could be in any of the office departments doing different things. My wife and I, we were pulled from our block assignments for a meeting with our corps coordinators, both the husband and the wife. And essentially it was a 45-minute long conversation where they accused me of all sorts of wild and crazy things. One of the things that they said is I couldn't possibly be able to run a foundational class knowing this information. And the ironic thing is I had just finished running the foundational class for the staff children about 3 months prior to this, and everyone on staff thought it was an overwhelmingly successful foundational class. And so that's why I pointed to it. I said, look, I ran that foundational class. I've run all sorts of foundational classes before. I've had a lot of these questions the whole time. Have you ever heard anyone say that I've taught any of this publicly? And the answer was no. And so
now, just to clarify for folks, the foundational class is the same thing as the PFAL, right?
It's a new version of the PFAL. Yeah, it was taught by Craig originally.
Craig Martindale?
Craig Martindale.
Okay.
He taped a copy in the 90s, and then they retaped it in the early 2000s with new teachers.
So to run a foundational class means to play out some tapes of Craig Martindale teaching?
That's correct. Well, this was no longer Craig teaching. This was the new roster of teachers.
Okay. So these are
2000s, right?
Right, but it's not you actually teaching the material.
No.
You're like a classroom facilitator.
That's right. Yep. I go up at the beginning and I say a couple of cool things or inspirational things, and maybe lead a couple of songs, or we might have what the way calls the worship manifestations, and then we roll into the tape, and then we send them to a break. And then we come out of the break and we play another tape. And usually the tape, the length is somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour each session.
Okay. All right. Thanks. I just wanted to clarify that for folks.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the point was I had done what he was accusing me of being able to do. I had done it many times and had done it in the Way Corps program under Corps coordinator's supervision for staff kids in the last 3 months. So clearly the allegations were false. The interesting thing about that meeting is Sean, if you had been a fly on the wall, you would have said, Will, why are you not speaking up for yourself? I just folded like a cheap tent because I didn't want to come across as the last thing I wanted to do was be egotistical or act like I wasn't meek. And at one point, the Corps coordinator said something about me. He alleged something, and my wife turned to me and she said, are you really guilty of this? And I said, no, I'm not. I didn't feel the need to defend myself very vigorously. I just felt my record stood for itself. And that's why I tried to bring him back to. And what was interesting is at the end of the conversation, I just asked him, I said, well, do you disagree with what I wrote? Is there something that we can talk about proactively from the Bible? Is there a way we can, is there something that I'm way off base on? And he said, no, I think I've thought about half these things before. And I was like, well, why are we doing this big old song and dance?
What is the point of this meeting?
Right. And what I found out later is, and I don't know what actually happened, Sean. I'm going to be honest with you, but the only thing I can think of is that he saw how thick the document was, how many bullet points there were. He got scared and he reached out to Reverend Rosalie Reidenbach, and I think she's the one who instructed him what to do, because it was totally out of character what my Corps coordinator did.
And Rosalie is the current president of the Way International?
She was the president and the chairman of the board at that time. I don't think she holds the president title anymore. I think she's a vice president or something now. She has stepped down somewhat. I say somewhat. I think she's still essentially running everything.
Okay. At the end of this meeting, you got dismissed?
No.
From the Way Corps?
No.
Or you were still in it, but just severely chastised and muzzled?
No, not even that. My Corps coordinator said that he thought our hearts were clear. I asked him what he was going to recommend to Reverend Reidenbach, and he said, we're going to recommend that you stay. And I said, great. And I said, look, I'd still love to talk about these points. And And if there's anything that I'm wrong about, I want to know as soon as possible. I want to have that conversation with you. And so I thought everything was good, and everything was not good. The next day, Friday, I was called back into my core coordinator's office, and I was told that the board of directors had made the decision that I was no longer fit, that we were no longer fit to be WACOR, and that we were being dismissed immediately, and that we had 24 hours to pack up all of our stuff and to get off of grounds, and that they would be assigning some other WACOR in residence WACOR to help us pack and make our arrangements.
Wow, so you got canned.
That's correct.
And was there any recourse with that?
Well, we tried, Sean. We tried. Obviously, we thought it was essentially a misunderstanding. And one of the details that I haven't mentioned at this point is that my father-in-law at that time was a high-ranking minister at the Way, and he was located at what the Way calls headquarters, which is where we were being trained. That's the main property that the Way owns in New Knoxville, Ohio. And so my father-in-law, who was high-ranking minister, a very avid researcher, I had many conversations with him on a number of the items that I brought up in my feedback in years before, and he thought some of them had some merit to them and should be discussed. He thought that it was all just a mistake, that it was just a miscommunication. So he immediately reached out to Rosalie directly and said, look, you don't know Will like I do. I'm his father-in-law. Trust me, he's meek. He'll listen. He's not going to go spreading stuff around. He's not going to handle this disrespectfully or out of protocol. Please don't dismiss him. Give him a chance to defend himself. And she refused. She refused to meet with us, and she said instead that we should write her. And so that's what we did. We ended up writing her a letter, and I actually ended up apologizing to her because that's what...
You're apologizing for getting fired.
That's right, exactly. That's because that's the way, again, that's the protocol in the Way.
Yeah, that's not a healthy environment, man.
No,
it's like they're abusing you, and then you're apologizing for their abuse of you.
That's correct.
And to be honest, a seminary really should be the kind of place where young people that are forming their thinking can push back, and it's a tremendously creative time in your life when you're at university, whatever subject it is you're studying.
Absolutely.
Could you imagine in physics that, let's say you had a hypothesis that challenged Einstein, okay? Now, your professor would come in there and let's say you handed in an assignment and that's what you did. The professor would then have to evaluate it based on its own merits. They can't just say, oh, you're Will Barlow. You can't challenge Einstein. Look, in real science, which, the Latin of which is just the word for knowledge, in a real pursuit of knowledge, this whole idea of the fame of the person doesn't have relevance.
Absolutely.
I don't know how else to say that.
No, absolutely. No,
but so I think you should be able to challenge things, and I think when it comes to theology, it should be the same thing. There are boundaries, right? Because if you're not going to consider the Bible as authoritative and inspired, then you're just not doing the same kind of thing as what that seminary is doing, right?
Absolutely.
If it's a Bible-based seminary and you're just doing documentary hypothesis and slicing and dicing the scriptures into 100 different authors and redactors and stuff, okay, well, you're just really at the wrong seminary for that. But within the boundaries of, and there are plenty of seminaries you can go to that'll do that.
Right.
But within the boundaries of what you're doing, you weren't challenging the Christology. Mm-hmm. You were challenging the explanation of the text. You were actually agreeing with the Christology, and in fact, you were presenting a better understanding that could help more people continue to believe in that Christology.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So
yeah, and you read the text of my memo, and we were over the top on saying stuff like, look, this is already a life-changing class. We're just trying to help make things better. And so I think that there was a lot of fear, both on my core coordinator's part in sort of escalating that directly to Rosalie. And I think, honestly, there was a lot of fear on Rosalie's part because she didn't want to adjudicate current way teachings with the Bible. She wanted to canonize Victor Paul Whorwell's teachings and act like there's nothing wrong with them. And I would have had a problem with that had I known that before I went in the Way Corps, much less while I'm in the Way Corps. Because I just don't think you can call yourself a research ministry if you canonize a set of works and you said, we're not going to question the contents of these works.
All right, so you got basically dismissed from the Way Corps.
Yes.
What happened next for you?
So
Because I heard from Jerry that you wrote some sort of paper with the whole question of believing equals receiving, which came up later. Is that where this fits in, or is that something else that happens next?
I've written a couple different things, and I've challenged a couple different wave doctrines, some more publicly than others. I mentioned to you the training manuscript that's unpublished that I eventually will get back to at some point, possibly, and continue working on. But I think it should be crowdsourced. I think it should be a lot of people working on something like that. I did eventually publish a book on apologetics called God and Science. Is Faith in God Rational? It goes through different branches of science and how they relate to the Bible. But, right after we were dismissed, we still attended a Way Fellowship, believe it or not, for about a year and a half. And a lot of that was, I grew up, my parents are in it, my brothers are in it, their wives are in it. My wife's parents were high-ranking ministers in the Way. We were trying to keep everyone, not necessarily happy, but it was just, we thought at the time the most gracious thing to do was just to continue attending a Way Fellowship. And I continued studying the Bible and started seeing some holes in a couple different things. The biggest one, besides my 10-page document that was controversial, was my Way Corps thesis was on the tithe, actually. It was on financial giving in the church, and I have an article series on that on my website. And essentially what I argue in that is that the tithe is a very specific thing that they did in the Old Testament to give 10% of crops or animals to the temple, and therefore the strictness of the tithe, and even we should be careful in the church how we use the term tithe, because what it literally was an offering in the temple. And there are even modern Jews, for example, that'll say stuff like, oh, we don't tithe anymore because there's no temple and we're not growing these goods in Israel and that sort of thing. That kind of thinking was also the opposite of what Victor Paul Wierwille taught in his pamphlet, Christians Should Be Prosperous. And so on the way out, beyond just the 10-page paper I wrote, they were also kicking on my research paper on financial giving. And so that was the other big thing that got me in trouble.
Wow. So what happened next?
So we attended Way Fellowship for, like I said, about a year and a half. And then I had just started my website and had published my book. And I knew that was going to put increasing pressure. I was going to get increasing pressure from the Way. And I was sort of waiting to see what that was going to be. And eventually how it manifested itself was our branch coordinator, local area coordinator, who's also the state coordinator of the state of Kentucky, came up to us after a branch meeting and essentially yelled at us in front of our small child. And I did not back down from that conversation like I had with my core coordinator. And I told him what I thought, which was, advancement in the Way is based on how much you agree with the teachings of Victor Paul Wierwille and how much you're okay with the decrees of Reverend Rivenbark. He did not like that. So he invited us to attend his fellowship and said that was the only fellowship we could attend. Up to that point, we'd been attending my brother's fellowship. And essentially, I could teach whatever I wanted in my brother's fellowship as long as it wasn't controversial. And so I taught a lot of things that were just beyond the scope of things the Way currently taught. It's just not against what the Way taught, but also new things I was interested in, and things I thought other people would find interesting. And so I certainly wasn't towing the line doctrinally, but I also wasn't breaking protocol. And so, he said that the only thing I could do is I could come attend his fellowship. And I said, well, why do you want us to do that? And he essentially said, to control us, to control the impact that we were having on the religious community. Yeah. And I said that wasn't unacceptable. And I said, look, we'll think about it, but right now my answer is no. my wife and I talked about it, and we just said, this is ridiculous. And at that point, a year and a half had passed, and my father and mother-in-law had had enough time to process things, and they had already decided to retire from the Way Corps. They were old enough to do so. And so they retired here to Louisville, and that summer we started our own Bible study, which we've been running since then.
And is that study-driven faith?
The Study-Driven Faith is the website that I run. It's just a project that I've been working on that allows people like me to present information. Our good friend Jerry Werwell has a couple. I asked him for a couple articles, which he kindly allowed me to post on there. My friend Ryan Tinsley also has some articles and some audio teachings up on there. My friend Jeff Gilbert has helped me a lot with that website. So, and it's the kind of thing where we're always open to anyone who wants to write something or record an audio teaching or whatever the case might be. We're happy to help people. And look, you don't have to agree with us. We just want to help take what you're presenting and make it the best that it can be, and give you an outlet to do that. So I do that, and then we do the Wednesday Bible study for people locally, and we also have a dial-in for that for some friends of ours that are X-Way people that would like a friendly environment for X-Way people, and so that's what we do on Wednesday nights.
And so are you X-Way at this point, or are you still in the Way, or what's your situation?
Well, we've been out of the Way, thankfully, for, it's almost 3 years now, officially.
And is that something that you said, I don't want to be considered Way anymore, or that they said, well, if you're not going to that fellowship you were just talking about, you're not going to come to that, then you're out? Or how did it happen?
I would say it was probably a mutual decision. I'm a dangerous commodity to them, and because I disagree. I've in the last 3 years have increasingly disagreed with their doctrinal stances, and so, they don't want me in a Way fellowship teaching things that are different. Not that I would break protocol and do that. But, from our perspective, the Way has been at the highest levels abusive to us, abusive to our family. I would say that how our Way Corps coordinator and how Reverend Reidenbark and how our local ministers, after we were dismissed, how those three sets of people treated us absolutely constitutes abuse. I think that's a fair assessment of the situation. And so I wasn't going to allow my family, my young son and now my young daughter, to be raised in that kind of an environment. And locally, again,
good for you, because then they would be subject to that same kind of treatment.
Absolutely. And the thing is locally, they're wonderful people. My wife had a recent very serious health challenge about a year ago. Many of our friends on Facebook are aware of it, but she had a stroke, actually. And in the wake of that, we had a tremendous outpouring of support from people in the Way, out of the Way, Christian, non-Christian, Trinitarian, non-Trinitarian. And we were just thankful for all the love and the thoughts and the prayers, and we're humbled by the response. And so, I feel nothing but love for the people of the Way. I think many of them are wonderful, wonderful people. They're God-fearing people. And I believe that they've been taught some wrong things. And I believe that the leadership has been trained to treat people at times incredibly inappropriately. And I really call for them to change that culture and change that mindset. And I would call for them to bring research back into that ministry and allow people to freely discuss and question things. But I harbor no animosity towards the Way as a whole, or especially the lower level people of the Way. We were abused by very specific people who had very specific powers, and they had the ability to take our dream away, and that's what they did. And what I learned in that was that wasn't what God called me to do anyway. That wasn't the dream that God put in my heart anyway. And that what I'm doing now, as difficult as it is to not have a full organization behind me, supporting me financially, or through putting people in my living room, every Sunday and Wednesday night, whatever the case might be, that God is leading me, the Lord Jesus Christ is leading me, and I have a wonderful extended community of people just like the Restitutio community, just like Living Hope. Your guys' church, Living Hope, not to plug for your own church here, but I've listened to like 6 or 7 of your classes. The free resources that are available just through that ministry alone are wonderful. And I told your dad at Converge that that's how a church should be run, where things are free, they're open to the public. Anyone can get on there and download it, do it whatever order they want to do it in. And all this information is just accessible. And so I just think it's wonderful what you're doing at Restitutio. I think it's wonderful what you guys are doing at Living Hope.
Yeah, I think my dad had a lot of similar experiences to what you described here. And the short version of his story is that after Victor Wierwille died, there was a power struggle, and a couple of different guys were vying for the position to take over. And Craig Martindale, who was a close friend of my dad's, sent out this letter saying he had to give absolute allegiance to him and the board. And my dad said, I can't do that. And this is ridiculous that you're asking me to do that. My allegiance is to God and his son, Jesus Christ, and to the scriptures. And I can't give absolute allegiance to some fallible human or group of humans.
Absolutely.
And without any recourse or discussion, they just simply fired my dad. This is in the mid-'80s or late '80s. And, the way was structured at that time, it probably still is, my dad didn't own anything. He didn't own his house. He didn't own his car. He didn't own his furniture. The only possession he had was his bed. And they said, all right, you've got 2 weeks. My dad had 5 kids. They said to him, you've got 2 weeks and you're out of the house. And that's it. And so that was his experience with the control and everything else. And looking back on it, he has said to me of that experience that was one of the worst experiences and best experiences at the same time.
Absolutely.
Because, just like they took the dream away, they took the carpet right out from underneath him, but at the same time, the local believers, many of them did go with whoever the person is that took over, but many of them did also stay with my dad, and that gave him the freedom as a fellowship coordinator to do what you were saying, which is do the research and start to think on his own rather than thinking within the very strict confines of what Victor Wierwille had taught previously, however many decades ago that was. So, I kind of grew up in the shadow of that mindset. My question to you, Will, would be: what about all the people that are still in there? I mean, you're not the only person, man. I tell you, I've met 3 or 4 couples over the last 2 years who are just like saying the same thing that you're saying right here, where leadership, control, these kinds of like bully tactics are basically squeezing them out where they can't rationalize to themselves staying in. And by and large, people come out of the way, and it's weird that they're so forgiving of the way of the way they were treated, but they are. It's just like, all right, well, I'm not going to hold it against them. What they did was wrong, but I got to move on with my life. And I'm sure it's very disorienting to come out of that umbrella and then not to have access to certain events that you're used to going to, and certain people that don't want to have fellowship with you or even communicate with you. But what about these folks that are still in it right now at the time of this recording in the year 2020? Do you have hopes that studydrivenfaith.org can reach them, or that other ministries can reach them, or do you have any plans underway to get? I mean, because really, these people are under oppression. So how can you help them?
Yes.
What do you think?
So that's a lot of the reason why I started Study Driven Faith in the first place was, as I was seeing things in the Bible that wasn't lining up with what the Way taught, I thought, well, I can't teach this in a Way Bible study, but what I can do is I can post this stuff online, and I'm friends with many people that are still in the Way, and so I post content, post articles, and also been teaching our local Bible study things. One of the things that we taught, I think it's almost a year and a half ago now, is we taught a series on the Kingdom of God, and I mean. You talk about some of the things I've learned since leading the Way. Dispensationalism was one of the first things that went after leaving the way. And once you get rid of that, I mean, once that obstacle is out of your way, there's just, I mean, it just explodes the possibilities. And so I'm going to start a series on Savior and Faith on the Kingdom of God. And what I would really want to do is I really want to break things down into small pieces and help people that are currently in the way, especially understand this whole time period's debate. And so, let's understand our options with dispensationalism, and then let's go into the Kingdom of God and see all the wonderful things that the Bible says about the Kingdom of God. And the interesting thing about the way is that, there are surprising things that they had correct doctrinally. I mean, of course, the biblical Unitarian piece of it, in the place of Jesus Christ isn't correctly portrayed in the way. But I'd say by and large, you score them 75% or something in that category. They got a lot of it right, and then the whole conditional immortality, soul sleep thing, they've got that right, and so these are people that are hungry for the kingdom of God. And once I presented that information to like my parents and my in-laws, even my mom is not a huge fan of new doctrines. It took her a while to transition on the Trinity. My mom loved our teaching series on the kingdom of God. And so that's what I'm hopeful for, is that, I've learned dealing with certain family members of mine and certain friends of mine, acquaintances of mine that have stayed in the way. I've learned that telling my sob story doesn't get anything done, because you can always rationalize it away. Oh, it wasn't as bad as he says it was, or, Rosalie must have had a good reason for doing what she did, or, there's some skeleton in his closet that's unaddressed. But if I can bring someone something from the Bible that can be verified, and and especially something like the kingdom of God that's so powerful and uplifting and so clearly biblical, that's my entry point into people's
faith. It might break the spell.
Absolutely. And so that's what I'm hoping for, is I'm hoping that study-driven faith, I would absolutely say that I try to tailor my posts towards people who come from a way background, because there are already so many wonderful ministries out there like Restitutio that handle general framework so well, and you cover so many things from a doctrinal perspective. And so really I see study-driven faith as having two purposes. One, to specifically try to reach that way community, or people who are in the post-way community that don't know what's right and wrong from, they know some stuff is wrong because they know how they're treated, and that leads them to think that there's something wrong with the doctrine, but they don't know what it is. And so I'm trying to provide a service for those people, both in and out of the way. Let's challenge our thinking a little bit. And the second thing, like I said earlier, is, let's give anyone an opportunity, young, old, way, not in the way, post-way, whatever the case might be. If you want to write an article, if you want to submit a teaching, we're happy to work with you. And so, maybe at some point we can develop into a baby Restitutio, where maybe people feel like Restitutio is too hoity-toity and beyond their abilities, or whatever the case might be. But maybe they can come on Study-Driven Faith and start writing articles and cut their teeth a little bit, and then produce content, on other sites that are more advanced.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing about the internet too is that the more sites, the better.
Absolutely.
And we can all link to each other, and we can all lift each other up.
Absolutely.
Just like a bunch of pieces of wood floating in an ocean, can turn into a raft and then support a human being. So I think it's great to have more websites. It's great to have more people engaged. Let me ask you this: do you think doing this interview will get you in trouble?
I hope this interview does cross Rosalie's desk. I wish she would take the time to listen,
Probably not.
But I'm not pretentious. We were never marked and avoided. And I know maybe your listeners don't know that term.
Well, maybe you can get marked and avoided now.
Maybe I can. I don't know. Let's lift my stock high enough to where I'm important enough to get marked and avoided, Sean. Let's do it with one interview. But no, I won't get in trouble for this interview. All my closest friends know where I stand, and they know what I'm doing with Study-Driven Faith. And I've got so many people that have supported me, and even my parents and my in-laws. They don't agree with everything that I've changed doctrinally, but there's a ton of unconditional love and support from them, and both of them live here in Louisville and attend our Bible study. And so, we've crossed a lot of bridges as a group, and we're a tight knit little community here in Louisville. So
that's excellent. You say on your site, the founders of Study Driven Faith wanted to provide a safe place for people to discuss matters pertaining to the Christian faith. As such, Study Driven Faith is an open community designed to encourage and strengthen those who want to become more Christ-like day by day. Would you say that that's your kind of like your vision statement there? I mean, I'm sure this couple of these words here: a safe place, an open community, encouraging research. These are all things that really speak to your experience of being stifled and closed and having these sort of like Gestapo tactics employed against you, right? So this has got to speak to folks that are looking to sort of like get the monkey off their back and see where God can lead them.
Absolutely.
In understanding the scriptures and understanding their beliefs better, right?
Absolutely. That's our goal. Our goal is to help people not just know more of the Bible, but also be more like Jesus Christ. And I think to do that, you have to have a lot of different things going on. But one of the things that we think Study Driven Faith can provide is, like you said, that open community to discuss matters of doctrine and practice. And so that's what we've endeavored to do. And as the time goes on, I hope that community expands and that more people. We don't have the following that Restitutio has, and we may never have that kind of a following, but we have impacted people, and we do have comments from people sharing that impact. And even if it's one person, I'm thankful, and I'll give my Restitutio plug now. But when I left the way, I felt all this pressure. I have all these things I want to present. I have all these things I want people to know. And really soon after that, a friend showed me your site, Restitutio, and it literally took all the pressure off of a young man with one small child and eventually another small child on the way, that I didn't have to redo the wheel. I didn't have to reinvent the wheel. And there's just so many resources available on Restitutio for people that have these kinds of questions. And so I'm just incredibly thankful for that.
Well, it certainly is gratifying to see how the work that we do here is able to help people. I would love to find ways that we could work together or that we could support you. And I think giving you an opportunity to share your story and getting that out to people will help people find you. Now, if people want to get in touch with you, how can they do that? Just go to studydrivenfaith.org, or how would they get in touch?
So there's a couple ways. You can use the email that's on the website. It's administrator@studydrivenfaith.org. But I'm also happy for people to contact me on my personal email. It's william.a.barlow, BARLOW, @gmail.com. And I'd love to hear from anyone. And if anyone has a teaching, or either written or audio or video, whatever the case might be, feel free to send it to me. And our small team will get together and we'll look at it and see if we can't offer some suggestions, and we'll get it up there.
Yeah, it sounds great. Anything else you'd like to say?
I'm just thankful that there's this larger biblical Unitarian community out there, that we can support one another, and that that there's wonderful people like Jerry Werwell that walk between all the camps and connect all of us together. What a wild guy he is, isn't he?
Yeah. Yeah, he's something else. He's in every group under the sun.
He's the only person I know of that says and does what he says and does, and is still not persona non grata at the Way International. No. If I showed up, there'd be security team alerted. But he shows up and they're like, "Hey, Jerry, how's it going, man?" And I'm like, "Jerry and I, come on, we're like the same guy. We're very similar in belief, And it's wild. But he does it. He manages it somehow.
He's the golden boy.
He is.
All right. Well, thanks for talking with me today. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Sean. It means a lot to me.
Well, that's it for this interview. If you want to check out more of Barlow's work, visit studydrivenfaith.org or get in touch with him via email, williamabarlow@gmail.com. And I've got that information in the show notes for this episode on your device, or go over to restitutio.org and look for episode 313, Questioning Way International Doctrines, and you'll be able to find the information and links there. We've got some comments in from our last episode, 312, Evaluating Dispensationalism Part 2 with John Truitt. Actually, these comments don't really have to do with dispensationalism or with John Truitt. These comments are mostly comments on my comments at the end of that episode, where I was responding to David Seaborn Jones's questions about how do we deal with a number of texts that specify the imminence of the kingdom. And in particular, the one text that a couple of people are commenting on here is the one from Matthew 24, where Jesus says, "This generation will not pass away until all these things take place." And I had commented that my take on that is that this generation means this generation that sees these signs taking place, as opposed to the generation standing in front of Jesus in that very discourse. I got this idea from Darrell Bach, to which I will return shortly, but I want to read out a couple of these comments just so you get a feel for what the objections are to this view. Carlos writes, if Jesus had wanted to say that future generation instead of what's recorded, this generation, he would have said so. I think he knew the difference. As many have noted, the better sense is to render Yunea, that's the word for generation, in this context as this present evil society, this present evil age. Let me pause you there, Carlos. I don't see any lexical grounds for that whatsoever. If we look up the word Yunea, definition 1 in the BDAG, which is the Standard Greek New Testament Dictionary, is those exhibiting common characteristics or interests, a race or kind. Number 2 is the sum total of those born at the same time, expanded to include all those living at a given time and frequently defined in terms of specific characteristics, and that's the word generation. Number 3, the time of a generation, and they use the word age there. So looking at those 3 main definitions, and the Little Scott Jones Greek lexicon is going to have these same options. We have either number 1, race. The second option is that it means generation, and the third option is that it means age. I don't see any lexical entry for this word where it means this present evil society. Let me continue reading Carlos's comment. Note also Psalm 102:18. This will be written for the Yunea to come, that a people which will be created may praise the Lord. Yeah, so that backs up the generation hypothesis. Maybe I'm just not getting what Carlos is saying here. Psalm 102:18 says this will be written for a generation to come. Yeah, okay. Jesus says this generation. So if you don't like this generation being the generation that sees the initiation of the signs, namely the abomination of desolation, then you are stuck saying that the people standing in front of Jesus, that generation, would not pass away until not only the destruction of the temple, but also the coming of Christ to gather together his elect. So I don't see how this view is helping. He goes on to quote 3 Bible dictionaries. The first is the Dictionary of the Apostolic Church of the word Yunea, Volume 1, which glosses it as this crooked generation. Okay, yeah, well, guess what? That generation has passed away, so I don't see that as helping any. The dictionary definition is, this crooked generation is the present swiftly transient period of the world's history which is leading up to the day of judgment and the new age. Let me just interrupt here. So if it's swiftly transient, I don't see how it could still be there hundreds and thousands of years later. This doesn't sound to me like a whole multi-millennial period of time. This sounds like a swiftly transient period of the world's history. And indeed, there was a swiftly transient period of the world's history between the time of Jesus and the time of the destruction of the temple. But the problem is that if we go with that interpretation, we have to have Christ coming back and gathering together the elect, and now we're all full preterists who are living after all of the events of recorded prophecy, and I don't think any of us want to go in that direction. Carlos also quotes the Dictionary of Christ and the Apostles that Unea, rendered generation, does express the current age of the world period is obvious in the Gospels. Well, that's just stating something. It's not giving any information about that. I would need to have more words from this dictionary than just one line. You could take this multiple ways. You could take this as saying that that world period, that current age, did pass away. Or you could say it didn't because Jesus hasn't come back yet, right? You could look at it either way. So that entry is not sufficient evidence to support the hypothesis that this generation means this age of thousands of years. Then he quotes C.E.B. Cranfield, who writes, Unea is best taken in the sense age, period of time, which is the primary meaning of the Hebrew door, the word it most often represents in the Septuagint and possible meaning of Unea. The whole phrase is contrasted with when he shall come with his holy angels, so is roughly equivalent to in this time, in 1030, which is contrasted with in the coming age. I think that supports my position, Carlos. I'm not sure how that supports your view on this, that this generation refers to many generations, as opposed to the generation that is either present, hearing Jesus in that moment, or the generation that is present that sees the abomination of desolation occur whenever that will happen. Anthony Buzzard writes in and says, Sean, where have I said this generation refers to this race? I say normally that this is this present age as distinct from the age to come. Well, Anthony, I obviously must have misheard you saying that in light of the dictionary definitions. That word, Unea, does mean race. You can look that up for yourself in the BDAG, as I mentioned earlier, or the LSJ. And maybe I conflated those two together, looking at the dictionaries and hearing you teach on this all those years ago. So please forgive my misremembering your interpretation on that. I obviously got that wrong. And then Ken LeProd writes in a couple of comments as well, which I'm not going to have time to get to for now. But I did want to just lay out all of the options that Darrell Bock gives us in his Baker Exegetical Commentary of the New Testament. It's a very good commentary, 2 volumes on the book of Luke, which also contains the same phrase. So his first option here is that Unea refers to the generation of the disciples who are addressed. And he goes on to say, well, the most obvious objection to this view is that it makes Jesus manifestly wrong, and the church perpetuated this error when it continued to circulate these remarks after the disciples died. If Jesus had really meant this, would not the church have buried such an embarrassing saying or abandoned this hope? The saying's presence suggests that something else is intended. So that would be the view that is held by many preterists, partial preterists, full preterists, depending on how you interpret the part about the sign of the Son of Man coming in the clouds. N.T. Wright and others do interpret that as referring to the judgment on Jerusalem by Vespasian and the Titus, the Roman generals, but I think a lot of us find that not very convincing. Bach continues, attempts to defend this view by arguing that Jesus did come in the form of Jerusalem's destruction do not work, since it is his physical return in total judgment, not an active judgment or mere rule, that is in view. Then number 2 for the options on interpreting this word is that Luke means his generation rather than that of Jesus. One's view of the nature of Jesus' prophetic gifts will influence whether this option is persuasive. It is certainly subtler to see Luke speaking of his generation rather than Jesus, but if Unea refers to contemporaries, then the more natural reference is to Jesus. So that would be option 1, Jesus' own generation. Option 2, Luke and his generation. Option 3 is that this refers to AD 70 as the end, that is, as the beginning of the consummation or as the type of the end of the world. The advantage of this approach is that it takes most of the terms in the rather direct sense, except for the key reference to God's consummated kingdom. This latter problem makes this approach unlikely unless one reads the point theologically in a prophetically shortened manner. There is no indication that the kingdom changed its nature in any way in AD 70, or that the later church recognized this event to be that transformation. So if that third option is to argue that the kingdom did in fact come in the year AD 70. Number 4, another approach takes a lexical angle to argue that Yunea means a given race, namely the Jewish nation. The point is that the Jewish race will not pass away before the end. There is a future for Israel. This interpretation is popular among dispensational interpreters, although not exclusively. Variations on this sense argue that Yunea means the human race, or this type of generation, i.e. the faithless generation. The point is that the end will come before the end of humanity, the disciples or this type of generation. There will be a time of vindication. The major problem with this interpretation in all of its forms is that it is debated whether Yunea in isolation can have a racial sense. Even more difficult is the equation Yunea equals Israel, which combines a rare usage in a narrow technical sense. Luke 16:8 is the only possible example where Yunea, people of the same kind, but the sense of this passage is disputed. In most passages, Yunea carries the sense of those living at a given time, the current time, a point that on the surface favors any of the first 3 views. If this rare sense is the meaning here, it is most unusual. Even assuming the lexical possibility, the following points are against this view in its variations. Number 1, the Semitic term that means generation cannot carry the sense of race. 2, a reference to humanity merely states the obvious. The return stops humanity from disappearing, or else why come? Number 3, a reference to the disciples as a race seems overly subtle, what indicates that they alone are this generation. And lastly, a reference to this type of generation is equally subtle, though of the sub-options, this one is the best, since the saying would make the point that evil people will be judged. So I guess this would be the one that Carlos and Anthony are arguing for, this idea that Yunea refers to race, but not really a race of people ethnically, but a type of people, stubborn people, rebellious people, people that are opposed to God, that there will always just be people opposed to God until the end comes. It kind of deflates the force of the statement, and it seems like we've had wicked people from the beginning, and we have had wicked people all throughout history, and the fact that there will be wicked people until the end is hardly worth even saying. But hey, it is a possibility, and it is sort of like a sub-option on the race idea, according to Bach. Number 5 is the already not yet approach that argues that in Jesus' view, the events of AD 70 and the end time are inseparably linked. I kind of like this one, just for the record. So that the fall of Jerusalem guarantees the completion of the other event. This view argues that the end has begun with events leading to the fall. That beginning happens within this generation. He goes on to say, as a result, Jesus is saying that this group of disciples will experience the catastrophe of AD 70 within their lifetime, an event that itself pictures the beginning of end-time events. As such, experiencing the fall in AD 70 is as good as experiencing the end because one event pictures, guarantees, and reflects the other. Those who reject this view argue that the things mentioned in the passage explicitly include end-time events. To accept this view also involves a shift in subject back to a focus on AD 70, which was seemingly left behind in verse 24 of Luke 21. This view is subtle, too subtle for most, but it does fit the prophetic genre. As such, it may be correct and should be considered as a viable possibility. Number 6, and finally, this is the view that I had put forward last week in answer to David Seaborn Jones. Another solution, Bach writes, argues that Jesus addresses the disciples as representatives of God's people. So when he speaks of the generation that sees the things, he means the generation that sees the events of the end. Some argue that this view is tautologous, making Jesus say the obvious. When you see the end, you see the end. This misreads the point. What Jesus is saying is that the generation that sees the beginning of the end also sees its end. When the signs come, they will proceed quickly. They will not drag on for many generations. It will happen within a generation. This view is a strong possibility and is the best of the options. The tradition reflected in Revelation shows that the consummation comes very quickly once it comes. The main objection to this view is that Eunaia usually refers to the present generation rather than to a deferred generation, a correct point. Nonetheless, in the discourse's prophetic context, the remark comes after making comments about the nearness of the end to certain signs. As such, it is the issue of the signs that controls the passage's force, making this view likely. If this view is correct, Jesus says that when the signs of the beginning of the end come, then the end will come relatively quickly within a generation. It is hard to be dogmatic about the meaning of this difficult text. Well, I realize that was really long, but I wanted to read it out for you because it really demonstrates the various options that are before us. And so my question to you would be, what do you think? This is definitely not something we need to be dogmatic about, but it is something that is really important, as David Seaborn Jones brought up. And I'm still waiting to hear back from him what his view is. So if you have a take on this or other resources to recommend that you feel satisfactorily and satisfyingly answer this important text, Matthew 24:34, then please come on to restitutio.org and leave a comment so that we can all benefit from your research on that. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week. And remember, the truth has nothing to fear.